The talk this evening, originally over the weekend I had been thinking I would offer a talk about dealing with pain and chronic pain, because I spent the weekend with a migraine and I thought, oh, this is good practice. I can just, share my painful weekend experience and how what the Dharma has to offer. But I reflected on the experience of having, I get migraines regularly and I've had them for years. And I reflected on what was most painful about having a migraine, all the symptoms, obviously the pounding headache and nausea and exhaustion and light and sound sensitivity, all that stuff. And I realized it actually wasn't the pain, as in the physical sensations, that were really that bad or that was the worst. I mean, it's pretty unpleasant, but the worst really is my emotional state, is really how I was feeling emotionally about the whole thing. So I shifted slightly the theme of the talk. So the title of it is Vulnerability. The cracks are where the light gets in, which I'm sure you all probably familiar with that beautiful lyric of Leonard Cohen's. So, so I mean, obviously, if any of you do struggle with chronic pain, physical, a bad back or any kind of ongoing chronic pain, the meditation obviously has a huge amount to offer. But I'm sure if you've ever heard a talk about pain or read anything about it in relation to the Dharma, you would be aware of the teaching of the second dart, or the second arrow. It's a very famous teaching of the Buddhas. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, that the Buddha taught that we have some pain, so let's say you have a bad back and it's obviously very awful pain, and that's the first dart, the first arrow. But the second dart is all the thoughts and emotions and reactions that we have to that first pain. So I always like quoting the Buddha, because this particular sutta, he describes it so well. So the Buddha says, the Blessed One said, when touched with a feeling of pain, the uninstructed run-of-the-mill person sorrows, grieves and laments, beats his breast, becomes distraught. So he feels two pains, physical and mental, just as if they were to shoot a man with an arrow and right afterwards were to shoot him with another one, so that he would feel the pains of two arrows. In the same way, when touched with a feeling of pain, the uninstructed run-of-the-mill person sorrows, grieves, laments, beats his breast, becomes distraught, etc. So yeah, you're probably quite familiar with that idea. So it's our whole experience of something, such as a bad experience of pain, our whole emotional and mental experience, that really determines how much suffering and stress we have. And I used to teach mindfulness courses for dealing with chronic pain, and I remember people with awful injuries and bad backs and so forth, who had every single day had a lot of pain. And they had, after some practice of mindfulness meditation, all of them really had a massive realization that the pain, the physical pain, was amplified enormously by the thoughts that, created so much more suffering, such as, I'll never be able to do anything I want to do again. I'll never be able to fix this pain. I'll have this forever. I won't be able to work. My career will be ruined. All the thoughts they had, the stories they had about their pain. And when they could reduce the thoughts and the stories about it, the actual experience of pain was reduced enormously. So for me, when I have a migraine, and I'm sure there's some of you listening tonight who've experienced migraines, and they're pretty awful. But they are temporary. for most people. But for me, the emotional state is can be really amplified by thoughts like, what have I done wrong to bring this on myself? Or I'm letting people down, or I'm not going to be able to cope. I'm not going to be able to look after my daughter, things like that. I've got a 7-year-old daughter. And, you know, that whole, you can get it off into a whole story about worrying about these things, and that just makes the whole experience so much harder. But I really have to say, over the years, my mindfulness practice has grown more refined, so that these days I'm mostly able to watch the emotions come and go and kind of surf the waves of it. So on reflecting on all this, the experience of, you know, why something like being sick is being unwell, having pain is so difficult in an emotional sense, I came to it that it is the feeling of being vulnerable, the feeling of being fragile, of feeling weak. For me, I felt that it's really difficult. That's one of the hardest things. And if any of you suffer from any kind of chronic condition that slows you down, or, you know, ever keeps you stuck in bed or at home, you'll be familiar with that feeling of not being able to participate fully in life, or that somehow you failed, or, you know, what did I do wrong? Why can't I cure myself? All that, those sorts of thoughts. But everyone, whether you get sick or not, feels vulnerable at times, at certain times. And for most of us, it's very uncomfortable. So perhaps right now, after all this isolation we've been enduring for the last couple of months, perhaps that has made you feel quite vulnerable. Perhaps you've realized that you need certain people or contact to feel strong. Or, you know, without seeing a lot of those important people, your social networks and friends and family, are you feeling, you know, who is there for me when I really need someone? Or what if I get sick, who will help me? You know, those are natural thoughts when we're feeling isolated. Or maybe, you know, you've had struggles like you may have lost your job or your income. There are many people going through hard times at the moment. And you can, again, feel extremely vulnerable, that you somehow like you've failed, or you're no longer a success, or you fear for the future. So these times of being vulnerable, you know, it's hard enough, but it's so much harder because of what we've been taught by our society, by, you know, the way that we've grown up. In a society that glorifies being strong and healthy, glorifies being successful, productive, winning, getting the girl, getting the boy, the luxury house, looking great, all of that stuff, seeming perfect. So a lot of people have come undone trying to meet these ridiculous goals that have been passed down to us by the media, the movies, from our politicians, celebrities, from our school perhaps, and often from our parents, who want us to help them avoid failure and weakness and vulnerability by having successful children. So how many of us were taught that crying and showing emotion was bad, and that we shouldn't show those sort of emotions? You know, that showed that we were weak, especially if you are of the male gender, even more so probably. But the reality is every one of us feels vulnerable, weak, fragile, many times in our life. In fact, many times each week. It's impossible to reach that unattainable goal of productivity and perfection. And of course, we all have times in our life when we feel lonely, or we get sick or injured. So that brings me to Leonard Cohen's beautiful words from his song Anthem. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. I'm sure you've heard that 100 million times like I have, but it's just so, so perfect. So Leonard Cohen was actually an ordained Zen Buddhist monk later in his life. And I really love that apparently his name in the monastery, he was given a name by his teacher, was Jikan, which refers to the silence between two thoughts. I just love that. So this lyric from his song is quoted so often because it's so important and so true. So not only does it say that vulnerability is just part of being human, just like sickness is and death is, but it also says that if you look at that so-called weakness or flaw, you'll find an opportunity for awakening. So that's where the light gets in. So every challenging experience has difficulty and pain in it, but there's also opportunity and awakening in that same challenging time. So nothing is totally awful, but nothing is totally fabulous either. So being stuck at home alone can be painful and sad, but there are small joys to be had there, like noticing the beauty of the plants in your garden, or reading that beautiful book, or hearing some beautiful music. All the things, those things that you wouldn't have noticed if you weren't alone. So for me, my example of having a migraine, it's very unpleasant and disappointing, and I feel crappy. But you know, there's even in that small pleasures, like when you have a migraine, you get to sleep for hours and you can fall into this deep exhaustion, and actually feels quite nice. And you can, obviously that helps you escape feeling nauseous and having a throbbing head. But so there's, you know, some pleasant things even in an unpleasant experience like that. So for me, the awakening is to be able to open up to those most difficult times and not shut down and tense up against them. To open the heart, try and have a spacious approach to something, even when it's really, really unpleasant. And I think the key to doing this is self-compassion. So when we feel really vulnerable and fragile and like we're failed or we're not good enough, that's the moment we need to bring that self-compassion. Really, you know, offer it to ourselves that, you know, we shouldn't have to be a certain way. You know, this is just what's happening in this moment, and just allowing yourself to be like imperfect, to be messy or sick or weak or teary or whatever it is. That is self-compassion. So vulnerability, feeling vulnerable can be hard for some of us because it means we have to ask for help and rely on others. So especially if it's something like being unwell or injured, or something where you really do need other people, that can actually be quite painful for some people to have to ask for help. If you feel alone and there's not someone you can rely on, it can be really difficult to ask for help. But actually it can be, if you get over that sort of barrier, that resistance to asking for help, it can be beautiful once you do, and liberating. So I remember when going back to another migraine experience, for me, when my daughter was only a baby, like 4 or 5 months old, I remember one time my husband was overseas for work for a few weeks, and you know, it was a struggle, like, you know, sleepless nights and all that kind of thing, but I could kind of deal with all that on my own. But then one day I got a migraine, And I could feel it coming on, and I thought, oh no, how am I going to cope with this, you know, this little baby and doing all I have to do for her. And just by fortune that afternoon, a friend who I actually know from this Dharma community, from going on retreats with her, came to visit me to meet my baby and to see me. And she had experience of migraines herself. So she when I said, oh, I'm getting a migraine, she totally understood. And I'll never forget that she just stuck around and she made dinner and she bathed the baby and she did everything right up until I could put Lila to bed and I could go to bed, and then she went home, even though she had kids of her own that were waiting for her at home. Just that moment, that time of kindness, like it's such a powerful thing for me, and being able for me to be able to open up and accept it was a big, beautiful moment too. And vulnerability is also painful for many of us because it means we are revealing our tender inner emotions like sadness, fear, or hurt. So if we're not used to that, it can be incredibly uncomfortable. But if we can practice doing that, being a bit in touch with those vulnerable feelings and, you know, open up and let them out every so often, it can be a lot easier, you know, when we're with somebody else, for example, to be able to open up and, you know, to allow ourselves to cry or to admit failure or admit feeling, you know, I haven't got it all together. And that is so liberating. That's I think a real awakening to be able to go, I'm not perfect. I have not got it all together, and that's okay. Right? It's such a relief to not have to have it all together. So let's all let ourselves off the hook. From tonight and from now on, I'd like us all to not be perfect or not feel we should be perfect or successful or have it all together. I do not have it all together, and you don't have to either. So let's all be the flawed human being that we are all anyway. And if we lean into it and even embrace that soft, tender, maybe painful inner core of ourselves, we'll be so much happier. Because we're embracing all of us, all of ourselves, not just some of the parts that we think are acceptable. Okay, so I'd like to finish with briefly just a minute of silence, closing our eyes. And take a minute to feel into that soft, flawed, vulnerable, and very authentic inner core of yourself. Just revel in being flawed, in being human right now. And the relief of not having to be perfect and not having to have it all together.